Hi, this is Alexandra Polly, and this is my capstone project on the differences between prison systems in America, Germany, and Norway. So actually, the first written code of punishment came from the 1700s BC. And the written code of punishment at this time was to give equal punishment to the bad behavior. So this is a historical concept that we've had for a while. The government has stepped in since then, obviously, and not handed it just for the citizens to deem what was a good punishment for the crime, because it did seem to be brutal and violent when it was just citizen on citizen. But during the Enlightenment period, people were really encouraged to look into humanism, rationalism, and science. But we learned that the prison systems around the world do not have the same standards. In America, we really focus on incarceration, and Norway really represents more of the rehabilitation. And the different approaches clearly have different results, and that's what I would like to go into today. And we're going to start off with American prisons. We are known as the incarceration nation, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but around 25% of the 5% world population is United States inmates. And the United States just continues to grow in the number of inmates. It should be noted that half of these inmates are in prison for nonviolent crimes that do center around drugs, but have lengthy sentences, which a large amount of these sentences are life without parole for nonviolent crimes due to the 3 strikes you're out laws and the fact that there are mandatory minimums. But what's happening within the prison itself? So there are a few flaws that I found in the criminal justice system, one being the 3 strikes you're outlaw. It is thought to be disproportionately harsh compared to half of these are non-violent crimes that have to do with being drug related. And it's actually argued on both sides of politics, Democrats and Republicans, that mandatory minimums for non-violent related drug charges is starting to fall apart. But once you're in prison, a big flaw is that the healthcare system is just abysmal. We've already talked about this in class multiple times, but you can use the 8th Amendment to show that this is just a cruel and unusual punishment to not even give somebody the basic type of healthcare that they would need. Now, there is a study discussed in one of my sources that show that 65% of healthcare workers believe that these inmates are getting exactly what they're supposed to get. They're inmates, and this is the circumstances of breaking the law. And it does go against the American Nursing Association's Code of Nurses and Standards, because you are supposed to be compassionate, respectful, professional, and with the utmost urgency for anybody that you treat. Now, there is a trigger warning for sexual assault right here. There is a massive issue with prison rape. Inmates must defend themselves at all times, and this is not just from other inmates. This can also be correctional officers too. There is stated that there's a zero tolerance policy when it comes to sexual assault or just assault in general in prisons, yet it happens to be one of the biggest issues when it comes to the prison system. There are surveys done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics that show that sexual assault has reached up to 13%, which ranges over 1 million, and most of those are repeated victims. Now, there was a pass in 2019 for the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission, but it has shown that it really just hasn't done hardly anything for the prison rape statistics. One thing that American prisons try to focus on is education. So once they're booked in prison, they're supposed to be going through testing that determine their education level. If it is below high school, they will be put in mandatory programs that will help them reach their GED or high school diploma. And once you've kind of mastered the GED high school level, there are vocational and occupational training programs that they are trying to put forth in most prisons. Now, these trades that you learn in prisons usually are based on things that can help the prison itself. That way you can learn from from experience within these prisons by free labor. Now, there are a few college courses that some prisons will offer, but inmates, of course, must pay for them themselves, and we do not do a great job at paying our inmates a good enough salary to even reach these programs. Now, let's get on to the German prisons. The German prisons did used to focus a lot on incarceration, but there was a push around the 1970s, according to one of my sources, that they moved more towards rehabilitation. They do think that immigration is a reason for the more of spike in poverty and incarceration itself, but for the most part, in 2003, the prison population has decreased all the way up into about 2017. Germany can hold up to 73,411 inmates within 183 prisons around their country. But in 2017, they actually only had an 87.4 capacity rate, which in America is completely overcrowded. Now, a big thing that they studied in Germany was youth offenders. They tried to find ways to get the youth to either not reoffend at a later date or just get them the help they need before they even reached incarceration. A study had shown that in the 1980s, youth inmates reoffended at a 70 to 80% rate in Germany. So they really started focus on job training and education for these youth offenders, which is because when they looked at these numbers, the unemployment rate going into prison was about a 40% rate before going. But once they were released and into the world, within 3 months, there was 60% of these inmates unemployed. So it showed that people were getting worse once being in prison. They weren't able to hold jobs anymore. And like that time period needed to be focused on better than just sitting them in a jail cell. And it also showed that youth offenders weren't necessarily scared of being arrested. They were scared of the reputation. So if they were not scared of the punishment, it didn't make sense to put them in prison just to sit there. So this is when they really started to push getting the mindset of these youth offenders in a different path. That way, when they went out into real world, they weren't stuck at where they were before they went into the prison system. So judges had started taking separate routes for the youth offending that focused more around alternative methods than incarceration. Not using incarceration as often decreased crime pretty well, especially in burglary and robbery. And this is when they really realized that the military-based punishments were not working. But Germany is a country that is subjected to a lot of immigration. So Germany has had issues with refugee and asylum seekers offending. But even with these immigrants, they really put forth more social therapy programs and how to help them navigate within their country and how they want their society to run. And this has overall proven to be a really great thing for Germany. Now to discuss Norway. Norway has the lowest recidivism rate in the world at 20%, with very violent crimes being rare. There are 58 prisons in which hold 3,600 inmates, and there's 2 juvenile prisons in Norway. Now, these prisons are known as open prisons. They are ran more of like a community instead of a prison that we would think of in America. They really focus on getting these inmates ready to be re-entered into society successfully. And they do this by education and rehabilitation and getting them ready into the job force too. They want these prisoners to be the good neighbors next door, the people that you don't have to worry about once you're put back into society. And Norway has shown that most of inmates have a lower education level than just the baseline citizen medicine in Norway. So they really emphasize reading and writing programs and pass the Norwegian Educational Act to put all ages access to education to gain knowledge and more productive skills to be brought into society. This also puts the responsibility on the inmate to be ready to go into society. And these educational programs have about 1,400 students per day, and they work with about 440 teachers that help them. So they give inmates responsibility for their daily routine, which helps them learn responsibility. Just simple things such as waking up early enough to go to your job is something that is put on them. They give inmates types of jobs that they will want to do out in society. This also gives them their own way of earning their paychecks, because they actually are paid fairly well for prisoners in Norway. And the income that they're earning within their job while they're in Norway prisons gives them a cushion for when they're released. They have a higher success rate outside of prison when they have just that monetary cushion leaving. And what Norway does for punishments instead of solitary confinement and things like that, they just take away your responsibility. So it's more as if you're like grounding a child per se. And they have to work back to get those responsibilities. And they focus their open prison system to, as well as they can, mimic the outside society they will be released back into. That way there's the normalcy and there's not like that culture shock of being released back into the public. And I think a lot of what we see with offenders and inmates is based on the general strain theory. Especially when we talk about more of American prisons, it is all survival. So if there is stress and strain on prisoners all day, every day to just survive or not be sexually assaulted or, by anybody, not just inmates, but by the officers that are supposed to be protecting you, you are going to have to act out of character a lot of the time and just in survival mode. You're fighting for your life. Really honing in on the fact that you are reminded a lot of the days of what you've done in American prisons is going to keep you in the mindset of you're a bad person, this is what you did. Constant reminder of stress is not going to be great. And that is why with Norwegian prisons, we're seeing them really incorporating the open prison system as a society to remind you that maybe it was just a bad decision you made. You can still be an active, great part of society. And this gives them a positive affirmation that they can be a better person once they leave prison. And in my conclusion, I would just like to state that clearly there's a lot that American prisons need to grow from. And I think that if we really looked at how Norway and even things that Germany are doing, we could really get people ready to come back into society in a better way. If we would more incorporate getting people trained properly in education, getting them trained for jobs outside of the prison system and being able to hire felons, it could really, really help us not have such a high recidivism rate. If we would focus more on rehabilitation for our drug offenders and treating them with grace and that they have a mental illness instead of that they're a criminal and they deserve to be locked in a cell with sometimes not even a pillow to sleep on. Do you want someone that has been treated this poorly in survival mode for sometimes years living next to you, suffering with PTSD from what they're seeing in the prison system? Or do you want someone that had went into a prison system and got educated, got the mental health care they needed, or even just physical health care they needed, living next to you? We could severely lower recidivism rates in America if we just took rehabilitation and education more seriously. And that's all I have for my research, so thank you guys for listening.